Hey everybody, I'm at the front end of a series I'm calling A Christian Case Against Donald Trump, and right now we're in Chapter 1, which is all about using authoritarianism as a lens for understanding Donald Trump. And in this video, I'm going to show as clearly as I can two diametrically opposed ways of looking at how we ought to use power and authority. The first clip that I'm going to show is the best 2-minute explanation that I've ever heard about exactly what I mean when I'm talking about the sort of behavior that Donald Trump engages in. And the second clip is from a guy who calls himself a Christian nationalist, and he wrote a book singing the praises of Christian nationalism last year. So I know which side I'm on in this debate, but I'm going to play the clips so you can hear both of them in their own words. But this topic is hard because a lot of people who don't identify as Christians leave comments on this channel telling me that Christianity is inherently authoritarian. So of course, they say Christians support Donald Trump's rhetoric of using power over his opponents. And it's hard to push back on that because the number of people who call themselves Christians who post comments proving them right. Many Christians in America do have an abusive authority problem. And we also have a bullying problem. I see bullying in the comments on this site every day. I'm not talking about people being mean to me. I usually couldn't care less about that as long as I've been getting enough sleep. But I'm talking about the dehumanization of the other, the exaggerated claims about the people that they disagree with in order to justify voting for Donald Trump. People who call themselves Christian quite often tell me that they support Trump because he's a fighter. He's going to fight the culture war on behalf of Christians. They'll even say that God has called him to use his authority to set things right in the world, which proves David French's point when he said years ago that a lot of Christians vote for Donald Trump so that he'll hate their enemies for them. So when I talk about the rise of populist authoritarianism around the world, the type that Donald Trump engages in, I'm not talking about any sort of legitimately established authority. I'm not talking about some mythical, benevolent dictator that we all know has never existed in the world. I'm talking about crooks, basically, mob bosses, people like Vladimir Putin, people who corrupt or destroy any institutions that get in the way of them amassing power for themselves and enriching themselves. And by institutions, I mean more than just our political system. I'm talking about the press, universities, the scientific community, our system of justice, any institution that could challenge the legitimacy of the mob boss. So Russia is an example of what happens when the mafia wins. It's basically an organized crime syndicate with nuclear weapons. So that's what I mean by authoritarianism. The steady corruption of all the institutions in our society that are supposed to hold powerful crooks in check. And yesterday, like I said, I heard one of the best descriptions of what I'm talking about. It was from Ian Basson on Nicole Wallace's program. So this is 2 minutes of brilliance. He strips the argument down to its essentials and then applies it to how Trump is handling his criminal cases. So just listen to this.
Joining our coverage, co-founder and executive director at Protect Democracy, our friend Ian Basson's here. Ian, your thoughts on, one, this moment, and two, the tactics being deployed by Trump and his allies in this moment?
Well, Nicole, I would zoom out pretty far.
Please, that's why you're here.
I'm gonna zoom really high up and think about kind of the fundamental different ways that we as human beings can live together. And historically, one way is a state of nature. Might makes right. If you're strong enough to go punch another kid in the schoolyard and take their milk money, you go ahead and do that. Some people have no compunction operating that way. They have no scruples, they have no morality, and they find that because they are willing to punch the other kid and take his milk money, that their opponent is the rules. For the rest of us, we don't want to live in that state of nature where we're constantly fighting everybody for a scrap of food. We would like a system in which we're protected, our property is protected, our safety is protected. We would like there to be a system of rules. Those are the two fundamental different ways that we can organize society, and we largely have chosen to organize a rules-based society. But there are people, bullies, authoritarians, people like Donald Trump, people like Vladimir Putin, that operate better when there are no rules, when they can simply beat people up, invade Ukraine, launch an insurrection on the Capitol, lie about what they're doing, falsify their business records, and just try to snatch and grab whatever they can. And Trump knows he operates better in that world, and so it is in his interest to attack every system of rules that the rest of us depend on for our peace and security. And I think fundamentally, to get now down to the level of what's happening in Lower Manhattan today, what Trump is engaged in here is an attack on the rules, an attack on courts, an attack on judges, an attack on jurors, an attack on witnesses, because they all represent constraints on what a bully can get away with. And it's woe to all of us if he is able to succeed in undermining the system that protects us all to be secure and free.
Now, I just think that's brilliant because it gets at so much. Some people thrive in a system where there are no rules, and we call those people bullies. The rest of us want a system where there are rules, because when there are no rules, society doesn't function and people get hurt. So everything Vladimir Putin does, everything Donald Trump does, is aimed at getting rid of the rules, getting rid of the systems and the institutions that try to apply the rules to them. Jason Stanley gets at this in his book, How Fascism Works. I haven't been using the F word, fascist, in this series because whether you label Donald Trump and his MAGA movement as fascist or not depends on your definition of fascism. I use the more general term populist authoritarianism because at this point, it's completely non-controversial for any serious person to admit that Trump fits that model. Fascism is a more debatable term, and it's unnecessary for this argument. But nonetheless, a lot of what Jason Stanley writes in his book applies to Donald Trump and the MAGA movement. And regarding these criminal cases, Trump's rhetoric is exactly the sort of thing we find in Stanley's book. Stanley talks about how fascist leaders use law and order as a powerful part of their message, except with a twist. He says that law and order only applies to the enemies of the state, and that the leader, because he's the leader, can't be guilty of a crime. And that's exactly what we see with Trump. He wants to be able to break the rules and enforce the rules against his enemies. I mean, this guy says that Joe Biden is weaponizing the justice system against him, even though this is a New York trial that he's in right now. Yet, he's the same guy who got elected by leading people in chants of lock her up. So, why do so many self-identified Christians support someone like Donald Trump? Well, it turns out authoritarians often use traditionally minded people of faith as their power base by making appeals to a time back when the country was great, back when everyone shared the same values, back before the world went crazy. And they promise that if you support them, they'll fight against the godless people who are trying to destroy the country. And what these bullies know is that if you rail against the other, whoever the other is in your country, if you rail against the other often enough and hard enough, you can demonize and dehumanize them to the point that people of faith will support you in fighting them, no matter the tactics you use. And that brings me to my second clip from the Christian nationalist Stephen Wolfe. I made several videos about Stephen Wolfe and his book, The Case for Christian Nationalism, a year ago. And I intended to do a couple more, but I just honestly got bored and depressed interacting with this stuff. But when I heard Ian Basson talk about the state of nature and the schoolyard bully yesterday, it reminded me of a clip that I played last year from Stephen Wolfe, who thinks we need to get back to that sort of state. And he's saying this as someone who wants to see Christian nationalism happen. He's dead serious about this stuff. So I'm going to play a little bit of him, and it'll be edited slightly, but that's just to take out pauses and extraneous words. You can see his whole conversation on YouTube on the channel that's listed there. So just a word of warning, though, if you do watch very many videos from that particular channel, I can tell you from experience that you're going to start getting a lot of ads for like emergency generators and survival rations and body armor, that sort of thing. Anyway, I'll just say this. This guy's view of Christianity is obscene. He's a smart guy, but he's got a dark point of view. And he wrote the primary book that people in the Christian nationalist movement have referenced this past year or so. So if you don't want to listen to him, his main point is that women have ruined everything, basically, by forcing men to abide by that very rules-based order that Ian Basson was just talking about in that earlier clip. He pines for a day when men can sort out their hierarchies like they did on the schoolyard, and he calls that Christian. So here he is being interviewed on that YouTube channel I mentioned, and I'll let the guy interviewing him speak for himself about what kind of a person he is.
One of your portions in the epilogue, talks about being ruled by women, which I completely agree with you. I've said this on my show before, so I don't know, so that you're not nervous, I'll show my hand ahead of time and let you know where I'm at. But I've mentioned multiple times on our podcast that I think few things have caused more suffering than women's suffrage. So I think that men should vote. Any book within Christianity, that sells really well and that people are like, oh, this was so good, is it always focuses on it's Jesus meek and mild, gentle and lowly. Jesus, it's the most feminine qualities that you could imagine, and those, I'm not saying those are objectively feminine qualities. Jesus is meek and mild, and Jesus was and is a man. Anyways, can you talk a little bit? Why did you include that in the epilogue, and what are you trying to get across to the reader?
Yeah, so I mean, when I wrote this book, it's not just like an academic exercise. It's not just trying to be precise for my fellow academics or whatever highbrow thinkers. I actually want it to happen. Like what's gonna prevent us from being Christian nationalists? Well, what's to bring it in a Christian nation that follows kind of principles of Christian nationalism? And I think one of it is going to be, I don't think it could happen when women are generally kind of in charge and rule things. And that's because women tend to have, they're very empathetic. Mm-hmm. They tend to be more inclusive, and men tend to be more exclusive. And in order to have a Christian nation where where blasphemy is punished by someone who seems well-meaning and nice and smiles big, you're going to have a guy who says, no, you're going to jail. I mean, or whatever it is that you're fined them. I mean, because I'm all for blasphemy laws, by the way. If you're going to suppress atheism, I mean, there might be some very nice guy who has a big smile, loves atheism. Like, no, atheism is crushed. Mm. And so I think that there's what I call kind of a gynocracy, which is a term that I didn't make up. It's been around. But one of the things that you see is this, because of empathy within gynocracies, you have this very strong egalitarian appeal, like following a very egalitarian principle. And what happens then within these groups is everything becomes very institutionalized, very proceduralized. A lot of times the men who are very assertive and agonistic, who want to actually compete with one another, kind of are suppressed, and everything has to be extremely cooperative and equality driven. And in the end, you don't actually have the naturally superior people arise to the top. Mm-hmm. And the benefit of like a masculine leadership, to my mind, is that men can compete aggressively with one another, and they can debate and they can fight each other, and they in a way can self-sort into hierarchies through this activity. So like on the playground, I mean, growing up, you can see on the playground, different guys tended to kind of lead the pack.
Right.
And sometimes there was conflict, but it eventually everyone kind of sorted out where they were in this hierarchy, and everyone figured out what they did well and what they you know, how they relate to everyone else. And everyone in general was kind of fine with that, with some problems at times. Just broadly speaking, if you have very kind of feminine-led institutions, you can't have Christian nationalism, because you're going to have a sort of empathy run amok.
Now, as I listen to this, I think about how that idea of fighting for preeminence, fighting for a higher place on the hierarchy, sorting things out through our fists, and then dominating and punishing those who don't believe the way we do. I think about how that sort of talk flies in the face of a passage like James 3, where James says, "For where jealousy and selfish ambition exist, there will be disorder and every vile practice. But the wisdom from above is first pure, then peaceable, gentle, open to reason, full of mercy and good fruits, impartial and sincere. And a harvest of righteousness is sown in peace by those who make peace." That's not feminine. That's not masculine. That's Christian. I know it's easy to dismiss people like this because despite like their pseudo-intellectual veneer, these guys aren't doing serious pastoring or serious theology. They're playing Dungeons and Dragons, Christian nationalist style. They're dungeon masters, and they want to take the nation on a quest. They treat the Bible like the Dungeon Master's Guide, and they pore over their favorite theology books like D&D rule books. I mean, they're world building. They say, let's imagine a world where we're automatically the good guys and our beliefs are automatically right. And then we can go on adventures and fight with people who don't look like us or don't believe like us. And let's imagine that mom doesn't have any power in that world, so we can be as naughty as we want. And since we're fighting the worst creatures imaginable, anything goes. We just have to be strong. And girls are going to like us. They'll be so impressed with us that they'll let us tell them what to do for the rest of their lives, and everyone will be happy. Well, everyone who agrees to play by our rules. I mean, that's basically what they're doing. So anyway, it's easy to write guys like this off, but all sorts of people read that dumb book, and they thought they were reading wisdom just because of his writing style and the fact that he had more knowledge of the esoteric theological D&D books that he was referencing. And it gets at a problem at the core of human beings, not just Christians. But Christians aren't immune from it. We're all susceptible to appeals to our basest nature. We have to resist those appeals. And when we see people making those thuggish appeals in the name of Jesus, we have to vocally reject them. We can't let people like Stephen Wolfe or that guy with the vaguely fascist haircut who was interviewing him, or Donald Trump tell us what it means to be a Christian. So thanks for listening.